Hello, welcome. You're listening to the Michael Harding podcast, and it's Friday again. And every Friday I talk to you about my loves and anxieties, my hopes and dreams, my writing, my life, my stories, and put it all together. It's a kind of a confusion. It's a kind of an uncertainty about who I am or what I'm doing. I oscillate between, I suppose, one kind of person and another. One person is in complete despair and despondency, and to be honest with you, this time of year is the hardest time for me. November. Once you get into Christmas. In fact, Christmas can be rough too if it weren't for Christmas, if you know what I mean. And Christmas gives you hope, and at the same time Christmas can pull you down because you'll be lonely and you'll be feeling outside the hope. And in November, you're kind of waiting for it all to happen. And then in January, you're exhausted and you're feeling like maybe physically and mentally you're worn out by the winter, and it's still a long winter to go. So, in a way, winters can be tricky. And that's even before you start worrying about your food and your heating. Well, I am here. And the only way that I get through it is by the balance of saying, I am here, I am present, and maybe doing a little bit of speculation as to what I'm present to. You know, when you say I am present, it means you're referring to something to which you are present. And what is that? There's a fellow called Professor Brian Cox. I was listening to him last night. He's very, very good. He's a genius of a scientist, and he knows so much about the cosmos. I learned so much from him. But, you know, he was talking, for example, about there being 400 billion stars in our galaxy. The Milky Way. 400 billion. That's 400,000 million. In our galaxy. And like the star around which our little planets are flying is just one of those 400,000 million. And that's where we are. And then he was talking about that being just a little corner of the universe, because he was saying that in the known universe, you know, that the universe as far as we know it so far, there's something like 2 trillion galaxies. And 2 trillion would be 2,000 billion galaxies, within which, like ours, there is 400 billion stars. And it's, you know, you can't get your head around it. And the good professor, he can't get his head round it, but he obviously is in awe about it. And so am I, and so are you. It's just hard to comprehend. And then Mr. Cox, Professor Cox, would not be a man to fall into the sentimentality of fate. He probably understands it better than I do. And so he's able to talk rationally. He's an atheist. And he feels that we're alone here. You know, that it's possible that in the entire universe we're alone. It's just this little planet. And it's only for reasons like, for example, the dinosaurs and all the big animals were wiped out by a stroke of misfortune for them, but that as a consequence it gave space and time for small animals to develop, and eventually for humans to develop and evolve. So, God, these questions about the universe and about it just they're beautiful. They stretch your mind. And I'm in awe of him. And I suppose I would be disappointed. There's no point in denying the fact that if you believe in your team or you want your team to win the match, it's always disappointing if you find somebody who doesn't believe in them or who believes the opposite. And I suppose one of the ways that I have my faith, my religious faith, affirmed is when I hear somebody who's wiser than me affirming religious faith. And so when I hear somebody that I admire and who talks so eloquently about the universe, and I think, he doesn't really believe in a God, he's just really convinced that science is the ultimate and absolute way to perceive all reality, I feel a little bit disappointed. And it's a pure egotistical thing on my part. It's like I don't have the confidence to believe in something on my own without having somebody else reassure me because they believe it too. And that's the way it goes with faith. But he certainly is a man who can bring you into a space of wonderment and awe about the universe. And a place of kind of fear and sadness too when he talks about the fragility of our planet and how if it got wiped out, and he says, it could, it really, really could. This little fragile earth, this tiny speck of dust in a corner of the universe, which may be the only place where the universe has meaning, the only place where life has evolved to a point of awareness that we become aware of the universe. And that could get wiped out like in a few seconds. That could get wiped out because we tip over and destroy ourselves, either by neglecting the planet environmentally or alternatively having some sort of terrible nuclear war or holocaust or accident. So he doesn't leave you, going to bed easy when he's finished with you. I was watching him on the television, and when he was finished talking, I didn't want to go to bed. I wanted to have a glass of single malt whiskey to relax myself, chill out. God almighty. It's terrible to feel alone as an individual, and it's terrible to feel alone as a whole global race, as a tribe of humans that kind of inhabit this planet. The idea that we might destroy it ourselves, and that the only kind of consciousness in the universe might be us. Remember that entire universe I'm talking about again, 400 billion stars in our galaxy. That's one galaxy. And then imagine 2,000 billion galaxies in the known universe, which is the bit of the universe that we know about. It just is astonishing. And to think of us being alone in that room is a loneliness that only Samuel Beckett's poetic, magnificent prose can embody. The loneliness of just being here. Now, here's my struggle. That while I find everything he says to be true, and in some way it's releasing as well, because in some way, religious faith can be kind of a burden. You can get caught into morality and caught into all sorts of ways that you feel shadowed or restricted by kind of unconscious policing sort of gods. That a lot of people who are religious, to be honest now, in the past, and probably in the present as well, there's an awful lot of people who do religion and they become very repressed. That the religion in a strange way can tyrannize you. And I've no surprise in me that somebody like Karl Marx was saying that religion was oppressing people. It was a kind of an opium, a drug that kind of laid them in a kind of a sleepy mood, but also a mood of being oppressed. And we know it from Ireland. We know the sense of fear and just oppression that existed, and the bullying and the tyranny and the silencing of people. You'd be in a small parish in the old days, and you wouldn't have the kind of sense of freedom that you have now. You wouldn't have a sense of you could go down to the shop, and if there was a discussion about politics or religion or, whether your daughter was sleeping with her boyfriend or not, you wouldn't just be able to do it. You'd be terrified. And terrified because there was a fabric of control and religious orthodoxy within society. So, and you only have to watch the news in relation to Iran and those women with their hijabs and the trouble they get into if they, show a lock of hair. You think of a lock of hair, fult groige, beautiful words in Irish for a woman's hair, fult. And you think of all the beautiful poetry that was written 1,000 years ago in Ireland and 2,000 years ago, love poetry, celebrating the beauty of the male and the female, the beauty of the woman and her long hair or whatever. And then you think that there's a society across the other side of the world that bans women from showing their hair. And not only that, but it does it in the name of a religion. It does it in the name of a religion which is controlled totally by men. It does it in the name of a God. The same God, the God, Allah, that I do talk about with such love and admiration. So there's no doubt that, from my point of view, as I reflect on things religious, I have an awful lot of questions to answer for myself. An awful lot of questions to ask about. And then when you watch somebody like Brian Cox, and he is so skilled and he is so erudite and he's such a great professor, he almost releases you. I felt almost released in one sense, like a weight was taken off my shoulders. Just watching him, just thinking how beautiful it is that we are alone. In that whole big, magnificent universe, how enormously wonderful, beautiful it is that we are just the only ones, and being the only ones by accident. It's just it's really worth going there sometimes. And it's really worth going there because when you feel you have meaning in your life, and I'm always preaching meaning, when you feel you have meaning in your life, sometimes the meaning can become in itself a restraint. Isn't that strange? It's I'll give you an example. Supposing I plan to go to Dublin. Now, I do plan to go to Dublin. I'm going to Dublin tomorrow. And that seems to me 2 weeks out from the event like a very, very pleasant adventure. It's a break from just being here writing on my own up in Donegal, and it's a break from that. And it'll be fun because there'll be I'll have to get the aeroplane from Carrickfinn to Dublin Airport, and then a taxi, and then the taxi will bring me into, where is it? RTE, because I'll have to do an interview there tomorrow morning. And then I'll have the whole day to myself, and I'll be doing other interviews in the evening, and on it'll go. But it seems like a wonderful liberation from what I'm doing here, which is just kind of, looking at a screen and typing sentences together. But the thing is that the closer I get to my planned trip to Dublin, the more it becomes a burden like a restrictive burden. If somebody phoned me today and said, will you come to Letterkenny tomorrow afternoon and have a glass of wine with me, or a little bit of a dinner party, I'd have to say, well, I can't because I'm going to Dublin. So what initially felt like a liberation from here, from the condition I'm in sitting at the screen writing, the idea of going around Dublin and seeing all the different sites, that seems like a liberation. But then when I commit to that, that then becomes a burden. Because then, I have to make sure that I go to bed early tonight so that I get up early for the plane. And when I'm Dublin, I have to be certain places at certain times. And it's not as freeing and liberating as I thought. Well, that's the kind of idea I have of meaning in life. When you have a meaning in life, it seems to liberate you from meaninglessness, and yet the meaning in itself can become a burden. And that's one of the most important things to me to share with people about faith experience, that there's a side of religious or faith experience which is deeply meaningful and feels like where you should go if you're in a space that is meaningless. If you're suffering from meaninglessness, if you're suffering from despondency or depression, or that there's no shape or form to your life, well, if you reach out into the religious space, if you make an act of faith, it will bring you great consolation. It will bring you out of that, soup of despondency, and it will give you light instead of darkness and so forth. And it's wonderful. But you can never say that without adding the second half, and the second half is that too can become a burden. Your religious faith can become a burden. You can become too obsessed with it. I remember going in, for example, if I go into town, and normally in the old days I'd go into town, I'd walk around and do my stuff and come home. Then I feel like maybe a little bit meaninglessness coming into my life. And what do I say to myself? Well, I'll go into town today and I'll pay a little trip to the church. Because I know that if I go into a large cathedral or a big church, any big church, I just love being there. There's a beautiful architecture. There's a beautiful space in a church. And you can sit there in the back and nobody bothers you. And there's always seems to be 3 or 4 people, never more, never less, in a church that I go into. And so you sit there and you maybe say a prayer, or you do whatever you do mindfully. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful release. You come back out the main door and bless yourself, and then you think, oh, now I have to go to Dunnes Stores or something. But you've been away from the ordinary world. You've been out of the mundane world for a little while, and it is so exhilarating to touch that transcendence, touch that sense of God's presence in your life, and it is absolutely wonderful. Now, if you're doing that for a while, you can often fall into the trap, as I do, that going to the church in itself becomes the focus and then becomes the burden. So that it becomes the new Dunnes Stores, if you like. You're driving into town, you're thinking what you have to do, get the various messages and see this person and that person and go to the post office. And you're listing up the various things and you don't have much time, and then you remember, oh, I better go to the church. I better go and say a prayer because that'll make me feel good. And that's what they used to call in the old days being scrupulous. I don't even know where that word comes from. I mean, it just jumped out of my memory from the old days, You talk about people having scruples. What the hell is a scruple? I must look it up. But do you know what I'm saying? That you have now put the release of prayer as the main focus. And then the main focus, you become as neurotic about prayer and going to church as you were about Dunnes Stores or your shopping, or, who your daughter should be sleeping with. So it's no matter what we grip as who we are. So if I am a person that grips neurotically then I find faith experience or, dropping into a church occasionally is some sort of release from that. That's beautiful, but ultimately the danger is I'll begin to treat the religious thing with the same neurosis. And that's where Brian Cox, the professor, comes into my life as an angel, as a saviour. He's a good-looking fella too. I wouldn't say he's young, but he wears the hair long, so he looks very attractive. And when you get a shot of him, by the way, his whole body, you'd realise he has a fine body. It's not just, as they say, it's not just a good-looking face. He's a fine body, and he's no beer belly. I envied him that. I was distracted for a moment from what he was saying. I was looking at the slim shape of him in the chair and thinking, feck him, he is a healthy body. Meaning that I would be struggling, I suppose. Struggling to avoid the apple tarts. Struggling to avoid the croissants and the corn buns in the morning. But that's another story. That's another kind of neurosis, isn't it? I think this morning's sharing with you is about how neurotic I am. And also how I always discover every so often that I can become as neurotic about religion as I would be about getting a book published or, doing tours around the country. The ordinary mundane things I do in life, things I love. My craft as a writer, all these things I love, but I get neurotic about them. I get anxious about them. My health I get really anxious about, especially because I'm growing old. I'm 69 years of age. I get nervous about that. But I use faith, I use religion as a kind of a life raft, as a kind of an escape place, as a place to go to have peace. And particularly in the winter, it brings me through this terrible waiting time of November, and then the intensity and an emotional tyranny that can be Christmas when everybody is sort of wishing each other well and everybody is almost compulsively happy. And inside you're terrified because you feel, well, I'm not really happy. And then the long winter through January and February. That whole struggle every year is something that is difficult for me. And I kind of get neurotic about it. I get over anxious about it. And what I'm sharing with you is that when I release myself into the space of faith, when I abandon myself to the Father God, I am free. When I abandon myself to the Mother, the great Mother, the Mother of God, when I abandon myself in these ways, I enter a space that's free. And I enter those spaces physically. I enter them in my body by breathing, by being aware of my body. And then, as I said in the podcast last weekend, I find a threshold. I find a threshold somewhere in my body, in my mindfulness. And I slip across that threshold into a space where I experience being loved. I experience the presence of God all around me, like a mother's arms holding me. And it is so beautiful. The phrase is, the old man sitting in the back of the church, and the priest said to him, "What are you doing?" He said, "I just look at him and he looks at me." And that kind of relationship, as if with another human being, when I draw that up to the surface and kind of experience it, I do it through my body, I do it through mindfulness. And then in the mindfulness I find this threshold across which I can slip. And then I'm present. I'm paying attention to the one who loves me. And it is extraordinary, and it gets me through November, it gets me through Christmas and January. it also gets me through my work. It gets me through the good and the bad days. It gets me through life. It gets me through bad health. It gets me through anxieties about overweight. It gets me through everything if I'm able to let go of everything and fall into the arms of the most tender mother. It's a beautiful, beautiful place to be. And in the past 12 months, I have been more and more sharing this experience with you because it has been my experience. I'm sharing it as a storyteller, not as a teacher, not as a philosopher, not as a therapist, but just as a storyteller, as one person to another, sharing with you that this is where the past 12 months have taken me from the time that I was ill. And it's a good and beautiful place. It's a lovely, relaxing place. It allows me to enjoy the day as I used to when I was a child. You know that lovely sense when you're a child and you didn't have a care in the world because in some sense other people were minding you. And you were free to play. Well, that's a lovely blessing. That's a lovely place to be, I have to tell you. And you know it as well as I do. It's a beautiful place to be. And it releases you from the anxieties and it releases you from all the sort of tensions about health, job, life, everything. It follows that lovely sentence that Jesus said, go inside into the room, the secret room in your heart. And that is a physical thing. One of the doors into that is mindfulness, physical body mindfulness, being aware of the body, the breath, and then the flowing thoughts running through you. And, go to a good teacher if you want to find out how to meditate. There's wonderful people. There's different people, different traditions. Go to any one of them or some one of them and learn how to do that stuff. It's not rocket science. And then use it. If you can, on a daily basis, or else even just when you're in crisis, use it. And then you'll feel really, really good. You'll feel really happy. And what I'm saying this morning is, it's a really, really tricky thing, that sometimes that other space, that space of refuge, that space of prayer, that space of religious faith, can itself become the focus and then will become the source of the same neurosis and anxieties that you experienced with the mundane. So instead of being neurotic about the fact that you have to go to Dunnes Stores when you go into town, you must go to Dunnes Stores, you have to get this, that and the other, and you're all wound up about the messages that you need and the price of the messages, and it's all like clenched-fisted anxiety. You let that go and you start saying your prayers and you drop into a church because it's kind of time out. And then that becomes a habit. You become, inclined to go again and again to the church. You're driving into town, you say, I must go to the church because if I go to the church, I'll feel better. And now you're going to the church with a clenched fist. The church has now become the new Dunnes Stores. So that's how it goes. We get release from the mundane universe. And we find the transcendent. And in the transcendent we find an experience of being loved. And it is beautiful. And the problem is, because we are the same person, we begin to cling to the transcendent. We begin to cling to our religion. We begin to cling to maybe church services or practices or visits. And then that becomes the potential for more tyranny. And on it goes. And where to find the balance in it? Well, all I can do is share with you what I feel myself, and it's this. When I listen to Brian Cox, for example, he kind of blows my religious faith out of the water. Same with Richard Dawkins. Although Richard Dawkins, well, yeah, no, he is good. He is good. They both, and all the other atheists and intellectuals who have no time for religion and who are very morally good people and who are very intelligent and wiser than I am. And they'd be telling you, that's all nonsense. And particularly the scientists, they're really good at this because they have a love for their science. They have a love for the universe. They have a love for the planet. So they're not being careless or aggressive or nasty when they, dispense with religion. They're being absolutely reverential to the planet we live on and trying to encourage people to awaken to the fact that we're alone. And that being alone in that universe is in itself beautiful. And even the longing we have in that emptiness, like the hole within us where God used to be, that longing that we're not complete, and just experiencing it and accepting it as beautiful. That there is something exquisite about being here alone, just us humans. Maybe on some other planet, I'm quoting Cox, the professor, he says, maybe on some other planet we'll find slime. That's all we're going to find, slime. And probably we won't even find that, he says. And you think, my goodness, what an amazing miracle that it took billions of years, where even this planet was here without having a single life cell on it. So it's extraordinary that we're here. And to listen to what happens when I listen to somebody like him talking about the science and celebrating the science as the complete way to understand your life, with all the consequences of that. By science, I also mean, of course, psychology and psychiatry. Those sciences, too, sometimes can lead you to understand the nature of the God within as being simply part of your own unconscious. The shared collective conscious with other people that has just evolved like millions of years, like the same as physical, bodily evolution, that these kind of templates of knowing of consciousness in our minds have also evolved, and there are archetypes within us that we share with other people. There are, if you like, dreams we share with other people, but that they are, in a sense, possible to explain within rational, scientific, psychiatric terms. It leaves us all in an empirical universe. And what I'm saying is that universe, and contemplating that universe, can be a release from religion when religion has become, in some sense, tyrannical. When you've begun to replace Dunn's Stores with the church, when your faith practice has become in itself neurotic, then you need release from that. So transcendence and contemplating transcendence is a release from the closed space of empirical reality. But if you then focus too much on transcendence, you begin to address it with the same neurosis, and you then need empirical reality as, if you like, the new transcendence. So that one is drawing you away from the other. You're never fully focused on one single target. One single way of seeing it, the empirical way of seeing it, you're missing the deeper truth of transcendence. If you look through the lens of faith and experience the divine, the transcendent, and make that the only way you see the world, then you're missing something else. It's like whether it's the positive or the negative of the photograph, you need both. You need the light and the shadow. You need the yin and the yang. You need one thing and the other thing. There's two ideas in Buddhism which completely sum up this, and I have to say that Tibetan Buddhism of the 14th, 15th century, they nailed this. They had this absolutely clear. Because they said that substantialism was one extreme, and that was an error. And nihilism was the other extreme, and that was an error. And that the correct view was somewhere in the middle. It's like saying that, if you like, Brian Cox's version of reality, empirical science, is the true one. And also Julian of Norwich, her view of reality, which is divine love revealing itself to you, that is the true one. They are both true. The heart vacillates between one and the other, and that is a healthy space to be in. That would be the Buddhist view. I think that would be the best kind of example I've been able to give of what is the most subtle idea in Buddhism. Again, people become Buddhist in the West sometimes as an alternative to being Christian, anything but Christian. And the Dalai Lama says, don't do that. You have your own tradition, follow it. But they turn to Buddhism and then start gripping Buddhism with, clenched fist. And people do this all the time with religion. They grasp it. But of course the ultimate teaching is there is no teaching. There's nothing to grasp. Because if you turn to your religion and grasp it in the same way as you grasp the empirical world and all your worldly goods, then you haven't changed. It's the letting go is the dynamic. You're in the real world. You're self-obsessed. You're worried like me. You wake up in the morning, you're anxious because it's November and you're worried about the dark days and you're afraid that you'll fall into depression or something. This is me now. I'm completely self-obsessed in that moment in the morning before I have my porridge. If I can let go of that, and light, if I can let go of that and light a little night candle in front of an icon and experience a presence that is transcendent, some presence in the world outside me, holding me, loving me, caring for me, then I have found release. But if I then start focusing on the icon and the candle with the same intensity, wakening in the morning and kind of grasping that idea, I must light the candle and say my prayers, I have become neurotic about transcendence. So there you go, you have light and shade, you have nighttime and you have daylight. And it's like we oscillate between the two. Everything about our whole cosmos is almost like one thing and the opposite. And the balance that we find between the two. And so Brian Cox, for me, is a manifestation of a good angel who reminds me that the universe is empirical, real, obeying laws of physics, discernible as a great inorganic empty space in which we are the only accident, the only amazing accident that evolved our consciousness. And all the dreams and all the unconscious stuff in my being is the result of things that can be understood by psychiatry. And then I understand myself as having this short life. And I'm happy. He is the good angel that reminds me there is no God. And on the other side, I think of Julian of Norwich, who keeps reminding me not only that there is a God, but that the love of God, the mercy of God, the intimate affection of God is as close as my fingertips. And I learn through the Buddhist way that wisdom, equanimity, and enlightenment, awakening come by actually allowing the daylight to take over from the darkness, allowing one thing to become the other, allowing myself to rejoice in icons and rejoice in my visits to the church, as long as I am doing it with a sense of abandonment, with a sense of finding spaces beyond the mundane. And also releasing myself every so often from my religious faith, releasing myself from all the tyranny, potential tyranny in religious faith, by listening to Brian Cox and others who celebrate the empty universe, the wonderful, amazing, complex, empty universe in which we are alone, in which we are the only ones who are here. And if the two things seem contradictory, then yes, they are, and they correspond to what in Zen you might call a koan. There's a stretching from one view to the other that leaves you balanced or poised in between the two. Substantial, it's true. Nihilism, it's not true. Wisdom, well, it is and it isn't true. The wisdom is that it is and it isn't true. And then that applies to everything. I always tell the story about the old Jewish man whose daughter says, "I'm so happy in this little village. I love being here. I'm going to marry the baker. He lives down the street. I'm going to be happy forever." And her father says, "You are right, my daughter." And then the other daughter comes in and she says, "Papa, I am so frustrated. This village is claustrophobic and horrible and hateful, and I have to go to Moscow to live a free life." And he looks at her and he says, "My daughter, you are right. They are contradicting each other. They are saying opposites. They can't both be right." And he says to his wife, "You know, you are also right." And I love that story it's a very, very Jewish philosophical position that kind of deals with every situation as it is and responds positively to it. So paying attention, the dynamic of paying attention, let's say to God's presence in your life, in your family, in the room, behind the icon, in the light of the candle, paying attention to God's presence all around you is a good thing to do. But if you start gripping it, if you start gripping that transcendent, numinous presence, then it's as mistaken as if you were gripping all your wealth and all your money and all the rational ways of looking at the world, and you were gripping them. You're becoming clenched, fisted about faith. And faith is actually letting go. So you let go of the empirical way of looking at the world through the lens of Brian Cox. You let go of that in order to find the hidden secret heart of the universe in yourself, the one who is not you but loves you. Finding that dynamic is letting go to that dynamic. It's releasing yourself from everything else to be with that dynamic. And that's what makes it so peaceful. That's what makes it so calm. But if you were making the transcendent world of God and faith and religion into a serious practice, then you can begin to grip that with the same intensity as you gripped things in the secular world. And then, every so often, Brian Cox becomes the angel that releases you. So that there are sometimes when I get too intense in the way that I grip reality. I grip reality in my anxieties about whether I'll get safely to Dublin tomorrow, and will I be able to do a proper interview with the television or the radio person. And all my anxieties build up about November, about winter, about my emotional, psychological health, about my physical health. All these things build up. And I turn to God because it's an alternative way of being in the world. It's opening up a door to an other space. A space where the voice says in my heart, be not afraid. All will be well. All will be well, and all manner of things will be well. And that's a beautiful, beautiful place to go. This is the whole heart and core of my podcast. I go to that place, I rest in that place. But I'm aware that the danger is, with all the religious stuff, you begin to grip it. You begin to hold on to it with a clenched fist in the exact same way as you held on to everything else. And when that happens, you need somebody like Dawkins or Brian Cox to really release you, and to open your mind again to the fact that this is an empirical reality. This is an empirical world. And there may be a bit of slime on some other planet, but in its vastness, we may be the only evolved species. We may be alone. Your life may be existentially what it is, 70 years or 80 for those who are strong. And that can be a release. That also can be a release. It's not the content of either view where you find wisdom. It's not in the content of religion, not in the content of atheism that you find the truth. According to Tibetan Buddhist ideas, it is in the ability to vacillate between the two, to pay attention to the two at those two different contradictory levels. It's what they call the diamond drill of awakening. The diamond drill. It's like those two opposite ways of looking at the world. Imagine them like as two sides of the diamond on a drill, and the drill is boring into you, like opening and awakening you. Because we live in the in-between. We live between the two. We live astride the grave, as Beckett said. And he was always fascinated by the two thieves on the cross. Do not hope. I think it was St. Aquinas said, do not hope because one thief was lost. Do not despair because one thief was saved. We live in a sense of balance about everything, and we can never live with certitude. Pay attention to the angel Brian Cox or the angel Richard Dawkins, as they reveal to me the real truth, the real empirical base of reality. And then I open Revelations of Divine Love by Julian of Norwich, and I pay attention to both. I fully abandon myself to the truth in both perspectives, so that I never begin to grip one of them alone too tightly. Look at it this way, and then look at it the other way. And that's how you loosen attachment to everything. That's how you loosen attachment to everything. And you begin to experience yourself as being present. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.